Okay, welcome to our survey of church history. This is now the sixth session, so this will take us halfway through the course. And so if you're reading the book, you should be about halfway through the book. No, seriously, it fits to about the halfway point to where we're going to finish up this evening. So Lord willing, next time we'll be getting into the Protestant Reformation. So that's where we're at with things. So in light of that, let's jump right in, and we're going to talk for a few minutes. We still got a lot of ground to cover tonight to get where we need to be. So skipping over a lot of things in church history, but there's a few things that we need to hit on tonight. One is the whole idea of what's been called Christendom. And historically, it points back to the coronation of Charlemagne in the year 800. So nice little round figure there for us. By the year 800, the celebration of the birth of Christ was well established on December 25th. That is the celebration of it. The practice of the celebration of the birth of Christ was on December 25th, which we celebrate even in our own day, in our society. Well, in that year at the church in Rome, which was dedicated to St. Peter, at the end of the service, the worship service, Charles, who was king of the Franks, rose from praying before the tomb of the apostle. And as he did so, Pope Leo III walked up, and in the words of an eyewitness, the venerable holy pontiff, with his own hands, crowned Charles with a most precious crown. And then the people arose as one. They've been told what to say. And 3 times they shouted out, "To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, great and peace-giving emperor of the Romans, life and victory." So that event was a very dramatic symbol of relationships which were changing at this point, and we're about to undergo dramatic change. A new form of Christian existence was now in place. It also outlined the shape of Christianity over the next 800 years, really. For the next 800 years, Europe became Christianized, like the Roman Empire had been under Constantine. Charlemagne had come to Rome in the summer of 800 at the climax of 50 years of cooperation between the Frankish rulers and the bishops of Rome. Mark Knoll, in his book Turning Points, says this. And sometimes I quote these authors and refer to them and don't give you the reference. But just understand that I'm drawing from a lot of different sources. There's nothing original, in church history. Everybody's drawing from somebody else and restructuring it and so forth. So there's a lot of good sources out there. But Charlemagne, King Charles, comes to Rome in the summer of 800. There's been about 50 years of cooperation between the Frankish rulers and the bishops of Rome. So there's been a long relationship going on between them. Pope Leo III had been charged with corruption by the Roman nobility at this point. And so what Charlemagne does is he comes to Rome to try to vindicate the Pope from these charges leveled against him and other things as well. And he had taken care of that. He had accomplished his purpose in coming well before Christmas, but he's hanging around the city mostly waiting for a number of reasons, but the big thing was the weather, so that he could get back home. So he's hanging around, and he stays and worships there in the church. And this event happens when the Pope crowns him emperor, the new king over this new empire. So Europe basically becomes Christianized, and now historically we look back at it and call it Christendom. We'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute, what that means at this point in history. So it's like Constantine in the early 300s with the Roman Empire has now come into existence in the year 800 in Europe with the European Empire. Now, what this means for us is that Western history is now shaped by this. Western culture is now shaped by Christendom, the tremendous influence of Christianity. There becomes cooperation between the secular and the sacred. And it is cooperated in such a way to make an integrated life, so that everything is integrated with Christianity. The Christian faith is the basis for society and culture now in the European sphere. Specifically, the way that it is communicated by the Roman Catholic Church. And it's protected now by the secular rulers. So Christianity has this flavor now in the Western world, in Europe. Now, during the Middle Ages, the sacramental system was developed in Roman Catholicism. And what that meant meant more than just a certain view of salvation that we, as in the Protestant world, would disagree with, which we'll begin to talk about next time, Lord willing. But it meant something else for that setting historically. It meant that the church became the foundation for all of life. All of life. So this is very dramatic. Now we mentioned, I think it was last time, Charles Martel, who stopped the Muslims from entering into Europe, and he lived from about 690 to 741. Well, Charles Martel was Charlemagne's grandfather. So he comes from nobility, if you were, from the line of a hero. Charlemagne ruled from 768 to 814. And that name simply means Charles the Great. So he was Charles, the king of the Franks, and became known as Charlemagne, Charles the Great. He was quite a warrior. He conducted 53 separate campaigns in pursuit of his chief goal, which was to unite all of the Germanic tribes into a single Christian state. He wanted to bring all these tribes that existed up in the northern part of Europe into a unified whole as a Christian people, a Christian empire. And so he's doing battle in order to accomplish this, and he's conquering lands. He conquered the northern part of Italy into his empire, which actually helped the Pope, because some of those groups were opposed to the Pope. And in fact, the historians tell us, he subdued the tribes between the Rhine and Elbe and gave them the choice between Christianity and death. See, his goal is to be a Christian empire. So you got the choice, become a Christian or die. And in one afternoon, he executed 4,500 people because of their choice. Before he died, he controlled Western Europe. really the whole of Western Europe. Massive empire of that day. And with the Pope now crowning Charlemagne in the year 800, there was a new comprehensive empire. That's what's important. It was a comprehensive empire that replaced the old empire that had been in place. And it was really in disarray. It really had been destroyed by Islam. Remember, we talked about this last time. So Islam had come in, and even though they hadn't taken over Europe, because of the infighting among the Europeans and because of the pressure from Islam and the expanding empire, Europe was really in disarray. And Charlemagne came along and unified all this with the help of the Pope, crowning him and giving him this coronation, this approval. Charlemagne now has a comprehensive empire that is based on the teaching and influence of the church, so of Christianity. And this now was symbolic for what would become a new and long-lasting, far-reaching phase of Christian history. So this kingdom was comprehensive in that the Pope would set forth the ideal. He would set forth the theory of Christendom. This is what it should look like. And the emperor would now be the power to force its implementation. Okay, so we've got the theory and now the practice of it brought together in Christendom. Now, this northern kingdom that Charlemagne had come from and had now united with the Pope had risen to prominence during the spread of Islam. Okay, again, Europe is in disarray. There needs to be some centralizing force to it, and this is what happens in the northern empire. So, what had happened is with the spread of Islam, there was a transformation of Christianity in Europe because of that pressure. So where Christianity before had been more of a Mediterranean-oriented faith, more oriented towards the east, now it was expressly European. It was more northward looking into Europe. So Charlemagne did the church-state cooperation which Constantine had, and now he applies it to Europe. And this is Christendom. So very important point in the history of the church. And what came out of this, another thing that came out of it, there's a lot that came out of it, a lot we could talk about, but what became known as the Carolinian Renaissance. Carolinian Renaissance. I should have put that up here, but it's Carolinginian. Carolinian is derived from Charlemagne's name in Latin, Carolus Magnus. And then Renaissance is French for rebirth. So historians look at this and call it the Carolinian Renaissance. Charlemagne used most of his income to establish centers of learning because he understood that in order to transform a culture, you have to teach that culture. And so whoever controls the textbooks, whoever controls the education, controls the culture, what the culture is going to be. And we see that in our own culture today. So the result of this, the result of him investing so much in this, is what has been called the Carolinian Renaissance. He attracted the most famous scholars of his day to his court, and he employed them. He employed the greatest of them of that day was an Englishman, Alcuin of York, and he established a palace school where the emperor and his family studied Latin, astronomy, and rhetoric. Alcuin also became the abbot, or the head of the monastery, at Tours in 796, where he established a sort of medieval publishing house. So you see, tremendous influence is going on at the time. Education, publication. The monks of his monastery copied by hand Jerome's Vulgate Bible. Remember, this is before the printing press, so they're writing everything down. And the works of the classical authors and the fathers of the church. So they were publishing all of these important writings which would transform the culture. Now we're not gonna totally leave Charlemagne, but we are pretty much going to. We're going to see he had one other area of influence which is important for us as we begin to look at Eastern Christianity, and then specifically here, what we're going to notice is the division that took place between the East and the West. As early as the end of the first century in church history, it is possible to look back now and see that there were differences between the West and the East. And just like there's differences in so many cultures. And these differences are representative of the differences between the East and the West that would later come. I mean, it wasn't called East and West in that day. There were differences in these regions that would then crop up, show themselves, manifest themselves more later in history. And then there will be this division between the East and the West, which is important. And all through the history that we've already been looking at, we can look back, if we were looking from this vantage point, and see these differences that are there and how they spell trouble for later on. But at the time, of course, they didn't really understand how it would show itself. But even Constantine, remember, he moved his capital from Rome to Constantinople, this new city he built. He moved it way to the east. So that meant something. We talked about the forces of Islam last time. Well, we're seeing now the influence of that upon Europe and even upon the East there. And so as we've seen already here tonight, the papacy begins to look to the north, not to the east. He looks to the north for these tribes, the barbarian tribes which are there and who've now been converted. At the same time, the Islam, the Muslims, are specifically the Turks, are beginning to encroach upon the Byzantine Empire. But there's also theological differences which are at play. There's a resentment I already mentioned, I think last time, with the papacy, talking about the Pope, how there was resentment in the East concerning the Bishop of Rome exerting power and authority over them. We're going to see how that plays itself out. So they resented the claim of papal supremacy over them in the East. And then there is the addition of what is known as the Filioque clause to the Nicene Creed, which simply mean, well, let me come back to that in just a minute, because that's extremely important in the division of the church. But what happened is that when the Middle Ages begin, there's, at least the way it's perceived to be, the Western view of it, when the Middle Ages began, there was a united church. And then at the end, there's a schism. There's a mutual schism between the East and the West, a division that takes place there. But when you step back and you look at this in a larger view, like I just kind of presented to you in a nutshell, what you find out is that the Middle Ages began with a division already. It just shows itself over a number of years. And remember, things move a lot slower in that time period. In our day, the division would have happened in one day, probably because of the internet. But in their day, it takes a long time, a number of years for all of this to fester and to grow. Beginning at about the year 700, during the Islamic expansion, when this is going on, what we need to understand is that leading up to that, there were 5 ancient patriarchal churches, as they were called. And 3 of those disappeared because of the spread of Islam. Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch, and Jerusalem were all taken over by Islam. Rome and Constantinople remained, and they remained as friends. The emperor in Constantinople and the pope in Rome, the bishop of Rome, both wielded great influence in the kingdom. And there was much interaction between the two. And in a sense, the unity of the two actually became stronger over time. From 654, from about 650 to about 750, about that time frame, that 100 years, Rome was more ecumenical than it had ever been because of the Islamic threat. What was happening is refugees were flowing into Europe from the Middle East. And so it was full of Greek and Syrian monks who were some of these refugees, Rome was. And so there's a lot of diversity that's being put into place. There's a lot of forces that are at work on this unity that existed. It was really a facade of unity that existed between the East and the West, as we're going to see. There were differences in custom, as you would expect, between cultures. There was political separation between them, so there were political forces at play. So there were societal, cultural forces at play. There were political forces at play. And you can see this looking back in church history. You can see this looking back in history. This is the way it works. And that's why you can look in our modern day and you can see this taking place as well. There are always these kind of forces at play and pressures put into a culture. But then there were also doctrinal differences. For our purposes, this is important because this is church history. There was a second Council of Nicaea. Remember we talked about the first Council of Nicaea. Well, there was a second Council of Nicaea in the year 787. And it was what was called an ecumenical council, so a lot of different groups and churches attending. And the Pope sent representatives, some of his particular representatives to it. But there were really no other church representatives from the West. It was all a Eastern gathering of church leaders. And really the council together didn't think that any of the Western scholars, theologians, would really have anything to contribute. The Pope didn't as well. But Charlemagne, who's in the north now in part of the West, and remember he's desiring to have this unified Christian empire, and this is before he's gone down to Rome and helped out the Pope and been coronated by the Pope, been crowned by the Pope. Well, he's building his empire there, and he has this concern for learning and scholarship and everything else at this point. And so he's slighted by this. He's saying, "What do you mean? You don't think we have anything you don't think we're smart enough to contribute to this? You don't think we have anything to contribute to this very important church council that's going on?" And so him and his scholars described the council that took place there in Nicaea as stupid and arrogant. And its decrees were erroneous, criminal, and schismatical, and lacking in all sense or eloquence. So Yeah, so there's real problems here. But the biggest issue that comes out of this is the filioque clause. It's very, very interesting what occurred. In Charlemagne's kingdom, among his scholarship, it was customary to sing the creed. They would sing the Nicene Creed with the addition of the filioque. Now, I'm using that term. What does filioque mean? It's simply the word that means "and the Son," S-O-N, and the Son. So the Nicene Creed talks about the Spirit proceeding from the Father, and the versions that we have in the West now say, and from the Son. So the Spirit proceeds of the Father and of the Son, or from the Father and from the Son. In some of the creeds that were in existence, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but it just had from the Father. The Holy Spirit proceeded from the Father. Well, in Charlemagne's worshiping in his kingdom, in his court, they also said, and the Son. There was that phrase in the creed. Now, this created great controversy. And the controversy really erupted when some of the Latin monks from Jerusalem visited Charlemagne's chapel and then returned to Jerusalem with the new version of the creed. There's other accounts, but it happened a little different, but let's just assume this one is correct. Whatever, there's a modified version of the creed. And this created problems, created controversy. And the Eastern Church rejected that form of the creed and accused anyone who would have this form of the creed as being heretics and innovators. I mean, after all, in their view, they've changed the creed, the historic creed. In a synod which was held in AD 809, the Frankish bishops, so this is Charlemagne's kingdom, declared that the Greek formula was heretical, and that it was necessary to confess that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. And they claimed the support of many of the Latin fathers. Later, a number of the Carolinian theologians wrote on the subject, defending the Western position. Now, Eastern theology used the formula from the Father through the Son. Now, just in their theology. On the other hand, the Western theologians understood that the Holy Spirit was the love of God, was the love of God manifested in part of the Holy Trinity as one of the persons of the Trinity, as the love that binds the Father and the Son. And so they would say it is mutual love between the Father and the Son. And so if you're going to take that view, they would say that you must say that the Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. There's a mutualness to it. So this one word has created tremendous controversy in the church. Now, Charlemagne and his advisors had an incredible passion for uniformity. Remember, they're trying to bring everything together. It's going to be a comprehensive kingdom. There's this unity in this kingdom. And they had the power to make their views prevail in the Western Church. I mean, he's the emperor, right? And he's killing people who were not professing Christ. So he has this power to do this. But the Pope is having problems with this at this point. And so he advises Charlemagne to drop the edition. Charlemagne said, no way, we're not dropping the edition. And gradually, the edition becomes, because of Charlemagne and his kingdom, right? It becomes the way that it is in the Western Empire, in everywhere but Rome. At Rome, there was no need for a controversy over this issue, because an ancient form of the Mass was used, which omitted the creed altogether. They didn't even use the creed at this point. So it's not an issue. It's a non-issue with them. The change would take place in Rome in the early 11th century, by 1030. So that becomes important in just a moment. So really, we're able to look now back in history and see with clarity the point of division between the East and the West in the Virgin Mass. All these other factors are at play. Okay, it's not just this one doctrinal issue. They've got a doctrinal controversy and they're going to split between churches. But this is the focal point. This is the distinct point of difference where everything comes together and causes a rift between the East and the West. So, time moves along. We come to 1054, and there was an attempt to reconcile. There's already this division that's taking place between the East and the West, with all these other issues coming to play, and in particular this doctrinal issue. And so they were trying to reconcile the two churches. The Pope and the Greek emperor had a common enemy, the Normans of southern Italy. So whenever you've got a common enemy, what do? You join up with your other enemies and you go against that enemy. And this seems to be the motivation that's taking place there. They both wanted control of that area where the Normans were. So they began to negotiate. Let's try to heal this rift and let's bring things together. And as part of the negotiation, because the Norman Knights are invading southern Italy at this point, and they're threatening the property that belongs to the emperor, who is Henry III at this point, and Pope Leo IX as well, and the Eastern Emperor Constantine IX. So there's an agreement that we need to try to figure this thing out. And so they agreed that the Pope would regain authority over the few Greek churches that exist in Italy, and that the Byzantine Emperor would then persuade the Eastern Patriarch, who's sort of like the Pope, okay? He's the Eastern leader of the church, the Patriarch of the church, to send the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, a letter which had been traditionally the kind of letter that was sent to Rome after the election of a new patriarch, but which this patriarch had not done. He's upset with them, so he's not going to do what tradition had been done. And so they said, well, you need to do this so that there can be peace and everybody can get together. So a lot of politicking going on here, as you can imagine. But the patriarch, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go along with this. So he said, well, I've got some demands of my own. And what I would like is that the Latin churches that are in Constantinople conform to the Greek rites. Right? You're going to give these Greek churches in Italy to the Pope. Well, the Latin churches over here need to become, in essence, Greek churches. Well, the churches refused to do that. And so in 1053, there was a letter from one of the leaders in the East that was sent to the West complaining about the incursion of Frankish practices into Bulgaria at the time. Pope Leo enlisted one of his most trusted advisors, Cardinal Humbert, to write a reply. And in his reply, he said, listen, in essence, I don't know what your problem is, but the Pope has authority over the entire church. And you essentially just need to submit to that. This guy was not a diplomat. And so what Leo ended up doing, Pope Leo, was he appointed a 3-man delegation to visit Constantinople and negotiate a better relationship with the East. So he's still trying to bring things together. Well, this 3-man committee is led by Cardinal Humbert. And he's one who just wrote that letter. And again, not a great diplomat. And the Patriarch of the East is not in the mood for compromise either. And so this Roman delegation arrives in Constantinople, and shortly after they arrive, word arrives that Pope Leo IX had unexpectedly died. So Humbert says, oh, well, we're still on the mission here. We need to take care of this. So he wrote a papal letter, a very official letter, which he wrote himself. The Pope didn't write it. But he takes it to the Patriarch of the East. And that letter reminded the Patriarch in no uncertain terms that the Bishop of Rome had unfettered jurisdiction over the whole church. The Patriarch rejects the letter, of course. And he says, and by the way, what authority do you have? The Pope is dead. You have no authority whatsoever. Humbert says, well, we'll see about that. So he delivers what's called a papal bull, which is an excommunication, a letter of excommunication. He excommunicates the Patriarch of the Church of the East. So he marches into the church. He places it on the altar of the church. As he leaves the building, he shakes the dust off his feet. He's excommunicated the leader of the Church of the East. A deacon grabs the papal bull, rushes out of the church after him, seeing this as his last chance to smooth things over, and says, you need to take this back. This is not good. You just need to take it back. Humbert says, no, I'm not touching it. And the deacon tries to give it to him, It falls to the ground. It's left in the street. And the Patriarch of the Eastern Church then excommunicates the delegation from the Pope. So you've got mutual excommunications taking place. And there is division between the East and the West. And so now you have Roman Catholicism, the Holy Roman Catholic Church, as they would call themselves, in the western part. And you have the Eastern, what has become known as the Eastern Orthodox Church in the East. And so that's why you have the two divisions, those two huge divisions, or I would say huge bodies that are in division. And so it's two separate churches, quote unquote, if you will, that now exist. Okay? So that's very important in the history of the church. Now we're going to see next time that the Protestant Reformation comes along and causes division within the Western church. And so now, for the longest time, before our modern world, it was pretty much just the Protestant movement and Roman Catholicism that we talked about, and nobody ever talked about the Eastern Orthodox Church. It was way over there. Nobody ever had anything to do with it. But now it's becoming more prominent, and the world is coming together in a global community more so than ever before. And so now you hear more about Eastern Orthodoxy. And we're learning now in the West, we're learning more and more about it, like it's some new thing, but it's existed for a long time. But let me move along because we do need to cover a couple of other subjects before we're finished here tonight. So the Crusades, always an interesting topic, and there's whole histories of the Crusades. Most of us don't know a whole lot about them in regard to the details. We know what we've heard these stories and seen movies and all the interesting thing about the knights and all this kind of stuff. But there's actually a lot to the history of the Crusades, and they're worthy of more study. I mean, I just saw a book the other day in the library that was that thick on the history of the Crusades, and so that thick, and 5 minutes or so is what we're going to cover. So just understand, not going to answer all the questions about controversy. Were they good? Were they bad? Were they needful? Were they not? I'm just going to present to you a little bit of the history, just so you'll have a flavor of something. Because most of us have just heard about it. If you haven't had much studying history, you hear about the Crusades, especially now. Okay, Islam hates us because of the Crusades. Well, I don't know. What is Crusades? What is that? Other than what we've seen in movies kind of deal. But the Crusades were from about 1096 to the year 1300. And basically they were a series of expeditions, of military/religious expeditions made up of European Christians who were seeking to gain control of the Holy Land from the Muslims. The Christians of Europe believed that pilgrimages to the Holy Land, at least some of them during this time, believed that pilgrimages to the Holy Land would guarantee the forgiveness of their sins, and even would heal their sick bodies and would bring about all sorts of miracles. Now, from the early 600s, Jerusalem was actually held by non-Christian Arabs. It wasn't under Christian control. But for many years, that was no problem for the Christians. I mean, it was just like another country controlling that, and they were able to travel there. And the Arabs let the Christian pilgrims come and go, and even allow Christians to settle there, so it just wasn't a big issue. But in 1071, there was a tribe of Turks who were Muslims who captured the holy city. And they were much more violent, they were more warlike, and some of the sacred places now in the holy city were being desecrated, were being destroyed. Christian settlers were being mistreated. Pilgrims were persecuted when they traveled there. And in the same time period, those Turks are threatening to overwhelm the Byzantine Empire and to drive all of the Christians out of the East. So they're knocking on the door here. They're threatening to invade. So there becomes this concern about the Turks, as they would call them, so the Muslims of that day. So and I think we can see, again, history repeats itself, and you learn so much from history. We're seeing that in our own culture. The spread of Islam, and especially militant Islam, there's concerns, there's fears, and so there's reactions. Anytime you have something like that happens, there's reactions. And that's what's happening in our culture as well. So you can imagine, put yourself in their position in Europe at this time. Islam is threatening them. They're definitely threatening the Holy Land, and threatening to spread further than that. And so Pope Urban II, his name, in November of 1095, called upon the faithful to take up the cross in Christ's behalf and rescue Christ's sepulcher, his tomb, from the infidels, and save the Christian Byzantine Empire. It was a historic speech which he gave, and that set in motion the whole crusading movement, which would then come from it. And this is where the idea of a red cross, which was worn upon the breast, became the symbol of the crusader. And crusader is derived from a Latin term meaning cross, crux, crusader. So this was very much a religious undertaking, a holy war, if you will, that they undertook. But it wasn't just one war. They went and fought for a few years and then it's over with. There were a number of crusades that took place over time. So the first crusade was from 1096 to 1099. It's often been called the People's or the Peasants' Crusade. Some of the leaders had, in fact, like some of these names, a man by the name of Peter the Hermit and others. They collected really these ragtag armies, these motley armies composed of peasants, vagrants, beggars, women, and children. And they had this fanatical zeal about them. They left from France, from the Rhineland, from what would be Germany, for the Holy Land, more than 2,000 miles away. Along the way, 3 of the mobs were destroyed or scattered in Hungary in response to their lootings, murders, and other outrages. But in July, a group led by Walter the Penniless, who was, as you can imagine, a poor knight, joined forces with Peter the Hermit in Constantinople to form the First Crusade. So you can see these weren't acting in a Christian way, okay? Now, I'm sure it was a mixture, okay? Just like you have with anything like this. It's a mixture of probably very devoted Christians within their group, professing Christians. But there were others, as you hear, they would go through and loot. They would take advantage. They had this army, and they needed supplies. And they're poor people for the most part at this point. So, hey, we've got the means. Let's do it. Well, they come together in Constantinople, cause all kinds of disturbances there. The ones that have survived up to this point, after this long march and everything that's gone on, moved now into Asia Minor, where the Turks are, and the Turks massacred them. So that's the first crusade. Not very successful. Then there was the Prince's Crusade, which is going on at really the same time, spring 1096, the spring of 1097. Now these were primarily the princes, the barons, the knights, and most of them inspired by their religious faith. Many of them sought adventure, the desire for power and wealth. There's a whole mixture here as well. But the Crusaders began crossing over into Asia Minor in May 1097, and after a long march, they spent the winter outside of Antioch. In June 1098, they captured Antioch, but then the Turks came back to besiege the city, which they had captured. But the Crusaders, discovered a spear in Antioch, and they believed it to be the spear which had pierced the side of Christ. And so they're inspired by this. And they rise up and they overthrow the Turks. And on July 15th, 1099, after 6 weeks of siege, the remnants of this Christian army captured the holy city of Jerusalem from the Muslims and massacre many people there, as the historians tell us. And while they still have blood on their bodies from the warfare, they kneel in prayer at the Holy Sepulchre. So the Kingdom of Jerusalem is established with this monarch in 1100, the king. To the north, other European princes also set up Christian empires in Tripoli and Antioch and other places. Many of the Europeans are attracted to the east, and this is when the different orders come into place. The Knights of St. John, the Knights Templar, you hear that all the time now, the Knights Templar, Well, they existed. It was these guys at this time, and the Teutonic Knights. And all of these were formed in order to defend the Holy Land and care for the pilgrims who were now streaming into the Holy Land. Well, in 1147 to 1149, there's a second crusade. Both of those former ones were considered the First Crusade. Some of these regions had fallen to the Muslims once again, and so there's a call for another crusade, and the King of France, the Emperor of Germany, leads this crusade, but it doesn't accomplish a whole lot. The Third Crusade was from 1189 to 1191. This is the one where some of your movies and shows will, and even books will talk about. This seems to be the age of the crusade where some pretty exciting things happen. And so in 1187, the great Muslim leader Saladin captured the Holy City with a huge army. And the news comes back to Europe, and so, hey, it's time for another crusade. We got to go and do battle with these Muslims. And so some of the most powerful leaders in the West lead the charge. The German Emperor Frederick I, who's called Redbeard, Philip Augustus, who's the King of France, and King Richard the Lionhearted of England. It's the most famous crusade of them all, and in the end, it really ended up in failure for the most part also. While the German army was crossing a river in Asia Minor after the long march from the west, Frederick, who was very old, drowned in the river. So Leopold of Austria took his place. The English and French crusaders reached the Holy Land by ship. They liberated the Christian city of Acre in July of 1191. Then Richard quarreled with his French rival, and Philip returned to France. So Richard continues to battle, but he's unable to capture the Holy City. He's the last of the original three kings to the start of the campaign, but he finally does obtain a treaty with Saladin, a 3-year treaty in which Saladin agreed to permit Christians to visit the Holy Sepulchre without being disturbed. And some have said that he would have gladly done that without the crusade anyhow at this point. But whatever the case, this is what they end up with. A Christian control over the eastern shores of the Mediterranean was maintained in this treaty. So it was an important treaty, crusade. Let me run through these other ones real quick. The Fourth Crusade was from 1202 to 1204. Pope Innocent III called this one. They were going to attack the Muslims in the Holy Land from Egypt, but to reach Egypt they needed ships, right? So they went to the ship owners of Venice, but in order to obtain the ships from the Venetians said, okay, well, we need a little something out of this. And so you see there's this city that is really a rival to us, commercial rival, and on the Adriatic Sea, and we need you to take them out, of course. So they did. Not only did they take them out, but they marched into Constantinople and looted the city. So here's these crusaders who are supposed to go do battle with the Muslims who are doing battle with the East. And the Pope protests and tells them to stop, but they don't. And as a result of this conquest, the Byzantine Empire falls, and to these Latins, as they were called. And so there's no real victories out of Fourth Crusade other than purely commercial and political. The Holy Land, nothing changes there. They're distracted from it, attack their own, so forth. In 1212, there's another crusade which is really a strange one. It's called the Children's Crusade, which was made by bands of French and German children They marched to Mediterranean ports, convinced that the sea would dry up miraculously and permit them to reach the Holy Land. Of course, there was no such miracle waiting for them, and several shiploads of the children were actually carried into slavery in Turkish territories. The remainder perished or straggled back home, wandered aimlessly around Europe. It's really a pathetic story. Some historians think this was the motivation, the inspiration for Robert Browning's famous poem, The Pied Piper of Hamelin. The Fifth Crusade was from 1228 to 1229, led by the German Emperor Frederick II. Jerusalem was handed over to the Christians as a result of a treaty, but then the Turks recaptured it in 1244. And then the Sixth and Seventh Crusades, Sixth Crusade 1248 to 1254, and the Seventh Crusade was in 1270. Louis IX of France, King Louis IX of France, failed to liberate the Holy City, which ended up remaining essentially in Muslim hands until World War I. And the fall of Acre in 1291 put an end to Christian rule in the Holy Land. There were few Christian traders, essentially, that remained, but the day of the Crusaders and the settlers in the Holy Land was over for that time in history. I'm going to take just a minute more because I've got to get this out of the way, and so we can get to the Reformation next week. Let me just mention real quick another very important time frame in history, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but the Inquisition. You need to understand the Inquisition. In 1578, there was a handbook for those who carried out the Inquisition that spelled out the purpose of the penalties of the Inquisition. And the Inquisition was basically punishment for not being a Christian. And it said this: for punishment does not take place primarily and per se for the correction and good of the person punished, but for the public good, in order that others may become terrified and weaned away from the evils they would commit. So if you came under the Inquisition, it was so that you would be made an example of for others. Now you can imagine what that means for justice and fairness. But that's what happened. There were actually a number of inquisitions, what's called the Medieval Inquisition, 1184 to the 1230s. Pope Innocent IV had authorized many of these, the use of torture in investigating heresy. Pope Gregory IX assigned the duty of carrying out inquisitions to the Dominicans. So they acted in the name of the Pope with his full authority. And of course, they're investigating heresy and these other things, and they can use torture to find out if you're a heretic or not. Yeah, okay. We think you're a heretic, so you say you're not, let's see if you really are or not. And they begin torture. Are you a heretic or not? And continue with the punishments. You can just imagine what comes out of all of this. So this is a dreadful time in the history of the church, professing church. The Spanish Inquisition also took place in 1478 to 1834. So a long time period there. King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I set this up. This was completely under royal authority, not just the Pope. Operated in Spain and its territories, targeting primarily converts from Judaism and Islam. And these kind of people would come under suspicion of either wanting to go back, of still adhering to their old religion, just claiming to be Christians, but you're really not, or wanting to go back to their old religion. Can't have any of that, so they would torture them and put them under the Inquisition. And the Inquisition continued to function even in North America until the Mexican War of Independence. In Spain, it survived until 1834. The Portuguese Inquisition was from 1536 to 1821. Some of it actually goes back to 1497, when the civil authorities expelled many Jews from Portugal and forcibly converted others to Catholicism. There was a Roman Inquisition in 1542 up until really almost around 1860. Most famous caught up in that one was Galileo, okay, who looked through his telescope and wanted everybody else to look through his telescope, and they said, well, you're a heresy for saying you're a heretic for saying what you're saying. He said, just look through the telescope. And they said, no, we don't want to look through your telescope. And so, you know. So that, I wanted to get that in because it's important to understand, even though some of this came after the Protestant Reformation, this kind of mindset is existing before the Protestant Reformation, along with all this other stuff that we talked about up to this point, the papacy and sacramental system and all this stuff, which really shows you why the Protestant Reformation was needed. The church was extremely corrupt at the point of the Protestant Reformation. So understand what was going on in that time frame leading up to the Protestant Reformation, and even continuing after that, as we've seen with the Inquisitions, continuing after the Protestant Reformation in the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, so with that, we're out of time. I'm not going to open the floor for any questions because you're ready to go home. And so let me say a quick word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed. Our Father, we do thank you for your goodness, for your mercy. So we looked at the dreadfulness of what some have done in the name of Christ throughout history. We're so thankful that you're merciful unto us. You're gracious unto your people. Help us to learn from the corruptions and mistakes of history, to learn not to repeat those once again. Help us to adorn the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ in our lives. And we pray this through Christ. Amen. Thank you.